Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name's Liza, and we're really excited to have you here today with us. Today, we're going to be going over Form Building 101, the basics, with iFormBuilder trainer and customer success manager, Barrett.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Liza, for the introduction. I'm really excited for today's topic. We haven't done one of these basic sessions for a while, so I'm glad that we're able to do this and hopefully get some of you up and running a little bit faster. As Liza mentioned, my name is Barrett Wamers. I've been working with iFormBuilder for about the last 10 years in Zerion, and I feel like I know the software really well, and it's always changing. So this is why we have these sessions, to make sure that people are always up to date and are aware of any of the new best practices that we have. So as far as our agenda today, we're going to start by going through how to set up for success. So what that means for your projects and what it means for building out your forms. We'll then go through some of the different elements of form building. And after that, we'll go through the Form Builder golden rules, then through the managing option list, and lastly, announcements. As we go through these topics, I will be doing a portion of it through these slides, and then another portion of actually going into the Form Builder and walking you through the interface. As Liza mentioned, if you have questions at any time, please interrupt. Let us know. I want to make sure that you guys are as successful as possible. So let's talk through this first topic. How do we set up for success? It starts with your project planning. So you have to start thinking through what type of data collection that you're planning on having. So are your users going to be collecting data via mobile devices? Are they going to be using our web forms, maybe our public links? Is there going to be a time with this project that you need them collecting data through web forms, public links, and mobile devices? And what does that look like when it comes to your form? If your users are going to make use of mobile devices, start thinking through what devices they're going to have access to. If they're going to be using public links, you also want to make sure you know what devices that they're going to use, so that you're aware of what type of web browser is available or set as the default for those devices. I'm not sure if you're aware about public links, but we do suggest using Google Chrome with that. So that's one thing that you want to make sure that's available to your end users if you're going to have a project with public links or web forms. You also want to think through, will the users be online? Will they be offline? Or is there a chance that they're going to have both experiences? The way that you build your form will have to keep this in mind, because there are some elements that are online only. So keep that in mind as you go through the process of building. You also want to consider the naming conventions. So when we go into the form builder and through some of these other slides, I'll share with you why naming conventions are so important, and not just how they organize your form builder homepage, but also when it comes to assigning forms, you need to have these naming conventions in place, because it makes it much easier to understand what's like a parent form, so that top layer form, versus anything that might be a subform or a database form. Again, I'll show you some examples of that in just a little bit, but naming convention and starting it right away when you start your projects can be extremely helpful, especially if there's multiple form builders building in your account as well. When it comes to building out your project, a lot of times someone just hands you a paper form and you have to go through the process of deciding, how do I structure this form? And one of the ways that you can structure a form is by making use of one of our elements called subforms. Essentially, a subform is its own form that is just being attached to another form. So almost like the first part of a book and a second part of a book. So you are attaching the two. So if someone gives you that paper form, start looking through that and say, how can I structure this and put subforms in place to make it a better and fluid experience for my end users? Also, when it comes to project planning, you have to think about what types of elements the users need to use to capture the data for your questions. So you want to make sure that whatever type of element you're using, it is the most effective for the type of data collection you're looking for. So you want to make sure you're really cutting down on human error. And lastly, you're going to look at where you can add form functionality. So the use of smart controls so that you can cut down on human error, you can cut down on that post data cleansing, and you can make this a really automated and fluid experience for both the data collectors, but also the individuals who are looking at the data after it comes in. So we've talked through this a little bit, building your forms with the end users in mind. So build for the device type, but also build for if they're doing mobile devices or web forms or public links. When it comes to using the app or mobile devices, Android and iOS do offer very similar end user experiences. However, there are some differences. There's also some differences in how JavaScript runs in both operating systems. So you need to make sure that you have both types of devices handy if that's what you're going to be using for your data collection for your end users. Additionally, when you're building out your forms, you want to make sure you're always testing on the smallest device type. I know that seems kind of silly to say, but if it looks good on that smallest device type, it's going to look great on the larger device type. And then, of course, as I mentioned, keep in mind if they're going to be using web forms or public links. What you have to keep in mind in that is with web forms, you're able to use some of the iFormBuilder built-in functions to populate usernames, first name, last names, really populate the information. Because web forms do require that a user has an iFormBuilder account login, whereas public links can be sent to anybody, and because they can be sent to anybody, you can't really pre-populate like a person's name because you don't know who's going to be collecting the data. And the public links, they don't need to have that login credential. So as I mentioned before, it is also important that you are considering how you're organizing your forms, and that's this naming convention. So this is where you'll notice just in this little screenshot below, we have this _P for parent forms, so top layer forms, and _C for any form that is attached to the parent form and is considered a subform. If you're unfamiliar with what subforms are, I will talk a little bit more about them in just a little bit. But as you can see in this naming convention, the parent form and the subform both start the same as far as elevator inspection, and then they change near the end to give a little bit more detail about what that form was designed for. So just keep in mind you need the naming convention to organize your form builder home screen, as well as when it comes to form assignments. This is what you're going to see under form assignments, so you need to have that naming convention in place. Best practices here. Have a device handy while you're building your forms. If it's going to be available on iOS and Android and maybe public links or web forms, have it all available so that you can constantly test to make sure it's working in every environment. When it comes to building out your forms, there will come a time where you are adding smart controls and you are making a more dynamic process. Maybe you're adding skip logic, maybe you're using our lookup element and you need to tie it to a database form and you need to see those names. This is where when you get through that process of building more dynamic forms, you need to open multiple browser windows. This is going to be extremely helpful for you because it'll allow you to copy and paste a little bit easier, but it also eliminates error. So if you are at that step of the process where you are creating more dynamic and more advanced forms, then definitely having multiple browser windows open can be really helpful. This next best practice is really about form assignment. So keep in mind that every single form that you create is automatically going to be assigned to your username. And because of this, your Form Builder home screen or iForm home screen is going to really fill up. It's going to show you every single form that you've created or imported, including subforms. Because of this, you may want to go through the process of going under Form Assignment and unchecking your username for collect rights so you do not see it on the iForm home screen anymore. The next best practice here is to limit the amount of elements that you actually place on a form. So the way that you can do this is try to not have more than 100 elements on a layer of a form. So that means you could have like 100 elements on the parent form, maybe 100 elements on one subform and then another subform and so on. So you can split up the amount of elements on the form. The reason we suggest limiting the amount is the way that our sync process works. So when it comes to syncing your device to the cloud, it goes layer by layer. So if you were to have, let's say, 500 elements on a parent form, there could be a time that the device would actually time out, and basically it would stop the sync altogether and nothing would be saved. So you would have to go through and try to sync your device again, and there's a chance that it wouldn't sync because there are so many elements and the size is just too large. So by syncing by layer, so let's say your parent form and then 2 subforms, the way that it would work is if you sync the parent form to the cloud and then it times out, then it'll just pick up where it left off with that next layer of a form. So it will eventually get all the layers up into the cloud, and then all the data will be there. So it makes for a much better experience. Another best practice here is to add a description to the field or element that may have a longer, more in-depth directions. When we go into the form builder, I'll show you where this goes and show you where it can be really helpful. Now keep in mind these description fields don't show up for every element, but they do show up for a majority of them. Our next best practice is one that seems a little silly to say, but always make sure that you include directions for the users. So a lot of times when we're building out the forms, we're like, oh, this seems really simple. They'll be able to pick it up. They'll know what to do. That's not always the case. So try to keep in mind who your end users are. Use our label element to put directions in there and just try to make it as user-friendly as possible. And lastly, one of our best practices is to make sure you follow the Form Builder golden rules. And we'll go through those in just a minute. Before we do that, Liza, we do have another poll, and I wanted to pause here and see if there are any questions.
Sure thing. So I'm going to first launch our second poll. If everyone attending could just share their experience with iFormBuilder. And it looks like we do have a question, Barrett.
Sure.
So it looks like we have a user that's familiar with the platform and that they use it daily, but it looks like they don't see the form builder in their account. Can you explain why?
Sure. So if you go into the menu, and we'll go through the iFormBuilder interface later, if you go into the iFormBuilder menu and you do not see the form builder, this means that whoever created your username didn't give you that policy or that permission. So you'll have to go into user management and get that assigned to you.
Okay. And it looks like after the poll has been closed, it looks like we have a lot of beginners, so a lot of fresh faces for the iFormBuilder.
Great.
And a few people that have been here for a while.
I'm sorry, what was that last part?
A few people that have been here for a while.
Great. Well, welcome back for those of you who've been here for a while, and welcome to everyone who's new at building forms, and hopefully you find this helpful. So the next part of our topic here is the elements of form building. So when it comes to building out our forms, we have some elements that are used more as appearance. So they're not actually collecting data, but they do help the look and feel of the form within the iForm home screen. We also have option-based elements, which can be extremely helpful to cut down on error because you're just allowing the user to make selections from that list. And we'll go through the option-based ones in just a little bit. We have our standard elements. So these are like your text elements, text area. These most similarly show what you would see if you were collecting data on a paper form. We have our enhancement elements. So these are the ones like our lookup element where you're able to call to a database to populate information, or our subform elements. Those are considered an enhancement element. Our image or drawing elements or multi-photo elements, those are also considered an enhancement because you're able to do more with it than what you'd be able to do on that paper form. We also do have scanning and hardware integrations, and when I show you the table of elements that we have, you'll see these with an asterisk next to them. And lastly, we have a few masking elements, and with these masking elements, you can actually change how the mask appears for the end user so that they are able to collect data meeting a specific mask that you've done or you've created as the form builder. So here are our 30 plus, 35 plus elements. As I mentioned, all the ones with the asterisks next to them, these are hardware or software integrations. We do have one element that does require online connection, and that's our HTTP request element. What that element can do is it can actually call to a public API so that you can populate information within a form. Now, after today's session, I will be sending over a form package to you that contains the majority of these elements in there so that you can import that form into your account and see how these elements function and how they work. I do want to point out here, when we look at all of these different elements, and if you go into our Customer Success Center, you might be trying to learn more about one or two of these elements. You may see these elements referred to as a widget, an input, or input type. In the last few years, we're trying to be consistent, and so we always call it an element, but years before that, we did call it a widget, input, or input type. And so this is where you might see those terms used other places on our website. They're all the same thing. It's everything within this table here. Now, I do want to point out here we have smart data collection as well as smart form design. Both of these concepts are going to be discussed in our next, in about a month, in our September 102 webinar, or Form Builder 102, which is in September. We'll be talking through how to build these smarter forms. So today's more about the basics. Next time we are going to talk through some of the more advanced functionality that you can do with Form Builder. As I mentioned before, I keep saying the term subforms. Here's just a little bit more information about what subforms are and how they can be used. I will show you how to add a subform to your project when we go into the Form Builder home screen. But this is just for your reference if you need to go down to it, get back to it later on to see really what subforms are and how they can be used. So as I mentioned, the form building golden rules are extremely helpful when it comes to your project. And the first one, and it might seem really obvious, but it can be forgotten sometimes, is to make sure you always test your form before going live or deploying it to your users. So this isn't just, oh, let me check on one device to make sure it's working. It's really going a lot further than that. So test on all your device types the end users will have access to. So if they're going to use iOS or Android, make sure you're testing on both of those. If they're going to be making use of web forms or public links, also test on those. Test on the smallest device type. As I mentioned before, if it looks good on the smallest device, it's going to look amazing on the larger devices. So try to always test on the smallest. You also want to test on the iForm app version that your end users are going to have access to. So one of our suggestions is to make sure that all your end users are always downloading the most recent version of the iForm app, and that helps you make sure you're testing on the same thing that they have access to. Another way to help with this is for your company or your organization to purchase the iForm white label. So a white label allows you basically to take the iForm app, put your own branding on it. You can also have custom integrations or custom setups. And with that white label, you are able to deploy it to the users whenever you're ready. So you're able to rest assured that they're all using the same version of the iForm app because they're all using the white label version. So that is just two ways to make sure, or suggestions on how to make sure everybody is on the same version of the iForm app and making sure it works properly in that way. A few more suggestions with testing. Complete the entire form. So don't just go through the elements that you just added. Complete the entire form, check the option list, the subforms, make sure everything has the correct assignments, make sure there are no spelling errors. That's one thing that people usually forget to check, so check that as well. Also, if you're going through and you're adding required fields, make sure all those requirements are configured. Sync the records to the cloud, and then go under the Data tab and view an Excel feed of that data. The reason we suggest doing that is because it's twofold actually. There's one step where you want to make sure when you're looking at that data feed, you don't see my element 1, my element 2 for the elements names. That's not going to help you when you're looking at the data later on. Another reason is we suggest that you look at a feed and familiarize yourself with it so that you understand how the data is going to appear, and if you need to change how the data appears, you make those changes before you deploy it to your end users. If you're making use of any smart controls, so maybe skip logic or hiding elements, you want to make sure you test all that functionality and make sure you're testing in the different scenarios as well, and sync those records to the cloud so you can see how that's appearing. Lastly, test early and often. One of the things that I do when I'm building out my projects is I always test after I add smart controls, or if I'm not adding smart controls yet, I don't have to test every time. I just wait until I've added maybe 5 elements, make sure it looks okay, and then go back with my form building. 2, as far our second golden rule is make sure you use unique data column names that are database friendly. So these are words that are not on our reserved word list. If you try to use a word that is on our reserved word list, you will not be able to save your form. You'll receive this error message, and then you'll have to change the name, which is really easy to do. We do give you information about the error as you're building out your form, so it shouldn't be too difficult to change. But we always mention this because it is something that does come up. And our third and one of our most important golden rules is do not change the element type or encryption on a live form, so a form that already has data in it, because it will delete the data. Keep in mind, initially we had it where you couldn't change the data size either. So if you've been a form builder for a while, you should be happy to know that you can change that data size without deleting the data, but you can, if you change the element type or encryption, it will delete any data that was previously captured. If you are planning on making changes, this is where we suggest that you make a copy of the original element and then disable the original element and put the new element underneath, and make any changes to that new element. If you are integrating that element with other systems, maybe a PDF generator, you can copy the original element's name and use it in the copied element so that the data still goes to the correct place in the database. If you have any more questions on that, I'd be happy to talk you through that at a later time. So with that, let's actually go and jump into our form builder. So let me just make sure I'm still signed in. Okay, so as somebody mentioned earlier, when they went in the menu, they don't see Form Builder as one of the options that we have like here. And that is because in user management, that individual wasn't given the Form Builder policy. So you will have to request that if needed. Once you're in the Form Builder, I do want to go through this interface at a high level. So once you're in the Form Builder, you'll notice that you can search for forms that are already in there. You can also change how this table is being displayed. So if you want to see a description of the form, you can check that little box. If you want to see when that form was created, you can check that bubble, created by, and you're able to really start to find out a little bit more about this form just by changing this table. You also have a drop-down menu for enabled and disabled or all forms. So in a little bit, once we are actually in our form builder, we'll go back to form properties and I'll show you where you can disable and enable forms. My suggestion here is if you are creating forms that are different versions, definitely go through and disable all your old versions so that they can't be assigned to any end users and they're not cluttering up your form builder home screen. What's also really nice is once you've made this table the way that you want it to look or give you the information that you need, we have these actions on the right. So you can copy a form, but you can also edit anything that's being displayed in this table. So if I click the tool icon, I now have the ability to change the label, the name, or the description of the form itself within this table. So I don't actually have to open the form, I can make these edits. And just so you know, if this is your first time building forms, anytime you click on a row for a form, that will open the form. But to continue here with our actions, so we've talked through how to make a copy of a form, how to edit the properties in the table, how to delete a form, and then you can also add a post data endpoint. So once you've actually built the form, if you want to connect this form to other web sources, you can actually add a post data endpoint here. And what this would do is every time a record comes in for that particular form, it would post to the endpoints that have been configured in this view. You can also create these endpoints under form assignment, but this is a little bit easier since you're already in the form. And lastly, if you're building out a form that is going to make use of public links, then this is where you can actually create the public link, or if you're going to make use of web forms, you can get the private link from here. So let's go through this process of creating a brand new form. And let's also keep in mind some of those best practices that we talked through. So when we look at this form properties home screen, we see form label, table name, description, and form icons. We also have advanced properties, where if you do want to add more customizations on how your form is used on the device, this is where you'll go to. So I suggest doing the advanced properties portion after you've already built out your form, because that allows you to make use of more of the reference IDs. But it is really important to keep in mind that we do have this advanced properties section where we have our dynamic attributes, where you could choose how certain elements function on the device. Also, if you're going to hide the trash can from the user's view, and lastly, these reference IDs. We'll talk through all of this in that second webinar, which is the 102 that we'll have in September. So let's jump back to our basic. The form label, this is what the user is going to see on your device. So anytime you see label, the term label, this is where you want to make sure this is user friendly. Where you see name, this is what's going to be used in the back end, and it's going to be lowercase and have underscores. And in this case, I'm going to just put in my form label. I can check off the box that says based on label. And then after the table name has been generated based off the label, I'm going to uncheck that and put in that naming convention that I talked to you about earlier. Okay, so right now this table name. You'll notice it is all lowercase. It has our underscores. I'm going to uncheck the box that says based on label and put underscore P, so I recognize that this is that parent form, that top layer form. If I wanted to make this name shorter, because I'm using it for, you'll use the table name for a lot of your smart control statements, so in that more advanced functionality. So trying to keep the table name short is usually a best practice as well. So you'll notice I just cut off all of that form building and just put FB and tried to really condense how long this table name is. I believe it does allow for up to 50 characters, but again, try to keep it short and sweet so that when you do use it in smart controls, it doesn't, there's no chance for error or less chance for error, and it doesn't take as much space. Now this description, this is also going to be viewable to the user on their device. So if you're familiar with the iForm app, there's the little I in the corner of every form, and that gives you the information about the form itself. So that's this description here. Underneath that, we have our form icons. So these are what will be displayed within the iForm app for this particular form. We have our standard that we see here. I've also uploaded some custom icons, so I can use those as well. Every profile within, or I'm sorry, every account within my profile can also see these icons. So that makes it really nice that other people can reuse them as well. And once I choose an icon, I'm just going to click create, and now my form has started the process of creation. So let's go through this interface because I know I have some brand new form builders in here. So as we scroll down on the left-hand side, this is where we see all of the elements that we have available to add to our form. When we're ready to add an element, all we do is click on the element, we see it in this device view, and then we move to the right and we're able to start filling in information about that element. The view that I'm in here is called the device view because, as you can see, there is a device. Now, if you prefer to have it more as like a list or a table, then we do have that option. If you look in that left-hand corner, you see that little green device, and next to it is that list. This will show you the table, and you can customize this table just like you could on the Form Builder home screen so that you can choose what you see in here. Now, for my preference, as I build the form, I do prefer to be in that device view because I just find it a little bit more user-friendly as I'm going through the basics of actually adding and moving elements around. You'll notice if your elements were hidden, they were just minimized, so you can expand that or minimize it again if needed. Now, before we go into this device view or into the common properties, I do just want to continue over to our menu here on the right-hand side. So by hovering over each of these buttons, you will find a little bit more information about what they do. But just as at a high level, we have our public link generation. We have where you could see the dependencies of a form. So let's say this was a subform. If I clicked on the dependencies, it would show me the relationship that this form had with any other parent forms or any other forms available. Also, when it comes to our option list, we also have the ability to see the dependencies, so see where those option lists are being used, which can be really helpful. We have our floppy disk to save, and next to that, and I do suggest saving relatively often. I probably do it after I do any sort of smart control, or maybe after I've added 5 or 6 elements, I'll go in and save. You have the ability to go back and edit the properties of a form. So if I click on that option and I go to my advanced properties, this is where I now see the disable form. So I mentioned earlier you can enable or disable forms so that they're not viewable to a user. Going into the advanced properties is where you'll see the disable form section. You'll only see it if the form has already been created. So when we went through that first process of creating the form, we didn't see the button there. Next, we have the post data endpoint. So if you do want to configure your post data endpoint from this view, you can. We have the ability for you to add or edit page level JavaScript. Again, this is something we'll talk more about later, but you can add more advanced functionality with this page level JavaScript. It always has to be placed on the top layer form, so that parent form, and this is where you'd go in and place that information. And lastly, if you need to delete a form, that can be done through this menu option. Now this is about deleting a form. You can also delete elements. We have had people accidentally delete a form instead of an element, so we have gone through the process of making it pretty difficult for you to delete, so that hopefully that doesn't happen anymore. Now, as we look at these element properties here on the right-hand side, these do change based off of what element you've added to the form. As we scroll down, you'll see that we have the label. Again, that's what the user is going to see on the device. The name, or what we often refer to as the data column name, is where you're going to have the lowercase and the underscore. This is what we'll see in our feeds. This is also what we're going to use for smart controls. So when it comes to building out smart controls later on, this is what you'll use. When we talked about best practices earlier and being aware of how the feeds look, you don't want it to say my element 1. You want it to be a little bit more helpful. So this is where you're going to want to make sure that this is changed to be helpful. The description, this is where I had mentioned earlier, if you do have an element that does have longer directions to the user, then place those in the description. And that's going to help the user out a lot more as they are completing that form, because otherwise it only shows the text at the very top of the header. And I'll walk you through what that looks like in just a minute as we start building this form out. We go into our element properties. Again, this is going to change based off of the type of element you have. If, for instance, I had selected date and now I want it to be a date time, I can change the element type from here. It does give me the warning that it will delete any of the existing data, but because I actually haven't collected any data, that's okay. Then we have our different attributes here where you can make a field required. You can add encryption. If you need to disable an old element, this is where you would do that. Disabling an element makes it so that that element is no longer collecting data, but it still holds that field or that row within your feed or view. We have our dynamic attributes. These are available just for a few different elements, and it is a drop down for that type of element, and it'll tell you what it can do. Lastly, at the bottom, or almost lastly, we have our smart controls, which we'll go through in that second session. We have element reference IDs, which are another way to really customize how your form functions on the device. And we have the info for the element that you currently have selected. So let's start by just going up top here, changing my label. And I am going to also check off the box that says based on label so that I don't have to retype it, and it is helpful. It's not saying something like my element 1. I'm then going to add a text element underneath this and just say, please share a little bit about yourself. Now, as we see here, this isn't a really long label, but if I put it in the description here, I can then add more details like your appearance, favorite color, whoops. So I'm just trying to get more from the user. But putting this in the description, it will show up to the user on their device. And I'll show you where that is in just a minute so you can see why it might be helpful and one of our best practices to put longer directions or information within the description. I do also want to point out here, now that this is a text element, I do see more element properties. I'm able to hide typing. I'm able to change the data size. And the data size is referring to the character limit. So if you are worried about the user putting in too much text, you can limit this down to a smaller size. Or if you want to give them more flexibility, you can increase that size. Now let's add one more element before I save and show it on my device. This is going to be that label element. So I mentioned earlier, we do have these appearance elements, and the label element is one of them. And the label element is where you want to put all your directions to your user. There isn't much to this one. I'm keeping it pretty basic. I'm going to make sure the name is helpful here. And then what I'm also going to do is, I notice that this label's at the bottom. Let's say I want it at the top to help the user a little bit more. So I can drag that all the way to the top. Let's say this element was actually, the 50th element on this form. Instead of having to drag it to the top, you can cut one or more elements and then paste those in the different part of the form. So there's this nice cut and paste functionality that you have available. I'm going to go ahead and save. And at this point, I am going to bring up my device after I sync the device and show you what this basic form looks like. Just bear with me. Okay, so every form that you build does go to the bottom of your screen unless you've ordered your forms with our sort order, and that's something that can be done with our reference ID 2. All right, so it's syncing here. I'm just going to go down to the bottom. So here's my form building webinar example 2023. If I open this form, I see our directions at the top. I see the date and time element that is required. It has that asterisk next to it. And then it has that text element where once I open the text element, it has that description that we added underneath. If we hadn't added that underneath, it would just show up at the very top as the label, and it would just show ... at the end instead of showing the rest of the text. So that's where that description can really come in handy. All right, let's just jump over here. So these are the steps we just went through. We talked about how to copy and edit some of the elements. I didn't show how to delete. So one thing is, if you do want to delete the element, it is that little trash can. Now, before we go any further, I know we're getting to the end here, just bear with me. We're going to go through the managing option list. I'll give you a little demo of how to manage your option list, and then we're going to have a poll and some announcements. So just an idea about managing option lists. So there are 4 different elements that you can add an option list to. There's the email element, the multi-select element, the pick list element, as well as the select element. We have this little decision tree for you here to help you decide when it makes sense to use the different option-based elements. So the first decision you have to make is, are you going to allow the user to make one single option selection or multiple single option selections? If it's multi, then that's very easy. You're going to use the multi-select option list. If you want them to make a single selection, then you have to decide, is this a long option list or a short option list? If it's short, then you're going to use our select element, which shows buttons within the form screen. If it is a longer list, then it actually launches a new, it'll launch a new window that will show the different options within a pick list, and you can actually search through those options. When it comes to our option list, there are 2 different ways that you can actually build your option list. One is with our inline option list builder, which is within the form builder. And this is great if you're making quick option lists or if you have a few edits that you need to make. If you're trying to create a much lengthier option list, then that's where you're going to want to go into our option list builder, and I'll show you how to build an option list in both of those places. But the option list builder I really love because you're able to upload option lists, you're able to download option lists, and go into an option list without actually having to go into the form itself. So there's a time and a place to use both of these, but keeping in mind that they're both available, I think is really helpful. So let's go back to our form builder here. And the first thing I want to do is I want to just show you how to add a simple option list to your form. We'll do a select option list, and we'll use this inline option list builder that will be here on the right hand side. So the first thing we do is on the left hand side, we're going to scroll down. I'm going to add just a yes, no, non-applicable question. And so that's going to be a select element because I only have a few options that I'm asking of the user. So is this webinar helpful? And again, check that name, make sure that that name is helpful as well. I'll scroll down on the right hand side, and underneath element properties, I now see this option list section. So if I click option lists, I am going to create a brand new list here because I want this list only to be used for this form. What's nice about option lists is once they're built in a profile, they can be used within that profile for multiple forms. So you don't have to recreate the same option list over and over and over again. But for today, I just want this one for this particular form. So I'm going to make sure that this option list name is going to be specific to the form itself. So I want to have that this is used for my FB webinar 2023. And this is going to be yes, no, and then non-applicable. So after you put in the option list name, you actually have to go and search for it. So that's a little frustrating, but you should be able to find it quickly. And then after you find it, then you're able to add the label, and then the key value should already be generated based off of the label. So at a high level, our sort order is the order the option appears on the list. Our label is what the user is going to see on their device. Our key value is what we're going to use for any smart control statements. It's also going to be used to display the result in the feeds. To keep this simple, we'll do yes, no, and then non-applicable. Once you're done putting in your options, click the little green check mark so it doesn't add another row. If you do accidentally add another row, all you have to do is just delete it, and then you'll be able to save. You'll notice that I can't assign the selected right now because I haven't saved this list. I know I haven't saved this list because it is still yellow. So I'm going to go ahead and click Save Changes. And then now that this isn't yellow anymore, I can assign the selected. At this point, if I were to look on my device, I would see this option list in here. Now let's say you have a list, and let me just bring up over my list. I have a list of over 100 different farm names. Now going through this inline builder and typing each one of these one at a time is going to take a while. So instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is I am going to go in and actually add a pick list element to my form here. And after I add the pick list element, I'm going to go and open up the option list builder window and add those option lists in the option list builder so I can actually just upload them instead of having to type them one at a time. So here's my pick list element, and I'm going to just call this farm names and click save. Once I do that, I am going to open up a new tab for my option lists. And all I did was I right-clicked and selected Open Link in New Tab. Now I'm going to click where it says Create List, and I'll call it my FB webinar farm names. So you'll notice, as much as possible, I try to follow these follow that parent form name, or at least how it starts. So I follow a naming convention, and I could clearly see that all of these forms are connected. So I click Create. And again, instead of having to go line by line, I click this Upload Options. I'm going to go back to my list that has the 100 farm names, copy all those farm names, then come here and click Upload. If I had saved it as a CSV upload, I could do that as well, and that would make it really easy. And if I had any smart controls tied into that CSV, then I wouldn't have to go in and type them. Let's go ahead and click Upload. So it looks like part of my list didn't want to upload because I must have had a duplicate in there. Let's see if that will work. And now that doesn't want to work for me. So let's refresh. Hold on. See what I have going on in my option list. So it actually ended up working, that it did upload, and I just must have tried to upload the same option twice. So if you have that same scenario where potentially you try to upload and you receive an error message, then go back and do the refresh like I just did, see if everything's there, and then it should be okay. So what it probably did is whatever I had in there that was duplicated, it probably just removed it for me. Now, just another best practice as we look through this, check to make sure the key value is what you want it to be. Like maybe I don't want to have the space between the S, I can edit it. And then I have it's yellow, so let me save again. And the last thing that I can do from this interface is that I can actually assign this option list to the pick list element that I created in here. So I don't have to actually assign it from the form builder. I can assign it from the option list builder by clicking the icon next to the trash can and searching for the form that we started earlier, our webinar form. And once I select the form, it shows me the different option list elements that I have within that form so I can make sure I'm selecting the correct one. It also tells you what type of element it is. Now, if I go back to my device here, I'm going to sync my device, and then I will show you what that looks like.
And one final question, Barrett. It looks like we have a user that uses the platform. They're happy with all the elements, but they're looking for an element that doesn't exist yet, specifically for uploading files. What do you recommend for this user?
One of the first steps is to go to our customer success center and go to our feature request page. And in here, you can actually go in and put in what your request is, what you'd like to see happen, and try to get a lot of traction on it. So the higher it gets with upvotes, the more attention it gets from our team, and then the more likely you'll see that being added to the platform. If you don't want to wait for that, you can always talk to your customer success manager, and they will be able to either give you a quote or talk through what it might look like to get that built out for the platform. Oops. All right, with that being said, I do want to just quickly show my device because I mentioned we added those option lists. And you'll notice at the bottom here, we have our yes, no, non-applicable. That's that select element. And then our farm names, we can scroll through or search for the specific farm we're looking for. And lastly, let's go through a few announcements before I let you go. One is that Zerion Academy has launched asynchronous courses now. So they are available to you. And I have a slide in the presentation. I'm not going to walk through these steps, but you're able to follow these steps to gain access to those getting started courses. Topics in there include just how to use the iForm app, how to manage your account, user management, also includes a data overview and company overview, profile overview. Also, in our announcements, we do have an awesome on-site session coming up. So that's going to be in Herndon, Virginia. So if you're in the area or can get to the area, it is September 12th through the 15th. We have workshops where we'll be talking through what's coming with Zerion and with form building and the iForm app. We are also offering certification during that time. So please, we'll send you a link. Definitely check it out, and I hope you can attend. And lastly, we have 3 more webinars coming up. We have on August 30th, how to add custom fields to users. We have on the 20th, the Form Building 102, so the building blocks of smart controls. That's where I mentioned to you earlier, based off of everything we discussed today, we'll go further into it and talk through smart controls at that time. And then on October 4th, we have public link forms, that they're more than just forms. That's a quick 30-minute session where we'll be talking through what public links are, how to use them, how to use them with like scanning like a QR code and launching data within those forms. So it'll be a really fun session. And with that, I want to thank you all for attending today, and I want to thank you, Liza, for hosting. If there's any questions at any time, I'm always available, and so is our team members. Please let me know if there's anything I can help you with, and I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I put all the links in the chat for the webinars that are coming up, and the on-site event, and also it'll be in the follow-up emails with the recording and slides. So if you need more time to discuss with your team or figure out if you can attend, we'd love to see you there.
All right, have a great rest of your day, everybody.